Sight and Insight by Rowland. Copyright Longman Group Limited, 1974. Commentary for Filmstrip 1.
We hear a great deal about the environment these days. That is to say, the streets and the cities, the villages and the countryside in which we spend our lives. Everywhere we read that the air we breathe is being poisoned by fumes from cars and lorries, fumes which attack not only living things but also our buildings. These same vehicles also clog the streets, so that city life has become both unpleasant and unsafe. We all know that many of our rivers are being polluted by chemical waste from factories. Birds are killed off in large numbers by insecticides, and so on. Most people now agree that something must be done to stop our environment getting worse and worse. And if we really mean it, something will be done. But this is not the only way in which our environment changes. We often hear of old parts of towns being pulled down to make room for new developments. Sometimes we see pylons strung across the countryside. And here, not everyone agrees, as most people do, about pollution. It may be that many people think they're not going to suffer from these changes. Others are simply unsure. We can measure the poisonous matter in the air and in the water, and if scientists tell us that it's a danger to health and life, we believe them. But how do we know whether new buildings are as good to live amongst as the old ones they replace? How can we tell whether industrial installations such as pylons and power stations improve the countryside or spoil it? There's nothing we can measure, as in the case of pollution. Neither have most of us any special insight or special sense that tell us what to think or what to feel about these changes. Most of us simply don't know. Many people say it's just a matter of taste. They say it depends on how you look at it. As we shall soon find out, nothing is purely visual. Nothing that we see remains in the eyes any more than what we breathe remains in the nostrils. A bad environment, even though we can't measure exactly the damage it does, may affect us as deeply as poisonous fumes, although it may not actually kill us. Through these talks and pictures, we shall try to look more closely at our environment, to see things we have perhaps never bothered to look at before, and to form, each one of us, his or her own judgment. If someone asked you what you saw on your way to school this morning, you might say, well, nothing special, the same as usual. There were houses, cars standing by the curbside, perhaps trees, nothing unusual. Then, as you turned into the main street, there were the usual crowds, streams of cars and buses, traffic lights and traffic islands with their bollards, lamp posts, bus shelters, a tube station, perhaps petrol pumps. You could go on and on like this, but you know all these things so well you hardly notice them, and that's why you said nothing special. So far we've been talking only about things, objects. You may think this is a ridiculous thing to say, for what else could there be but things? Isn't your environment, any environment, made up of things? Well, that's not strictly speaking true. What we see in the first place is not the things we believe we see, but rather a pattern of shapes and colors. We tie some shapes and colors together and say this is a house, and then we do the same with another group and say this is a car, and so forth. In this way, we build up a pattern of things from the pattern of shapes and colors. Before we can see the things of which our environment is made up, we must select, we must pick out certain shapes and colors from the mass of shapes and colors which our eyes can see. When we look at this picture, we see a great many dots, but some of them are more important than others, because we can link them up and recognize the figure 5. The other dots are far less important and we ignore them. It's almost as though we hadn't seen them. To most people, this mass of dots would have no meaning at all if they couldn't sort them out in this way and read the figure 5. This is roughly the way in which we read the great pattern which our environment offers to our eyes. Not, of course, with little colored dots, but with many different shapes and a bewildering number of colors. We should be completely lost in the world if we hadn't learned to deal with vision in this way, to form the shapes we see into groups, and to give a name to each group, such as house or car. Of course, nothing is without its disadvantages, and our perception, that's the name we normally give to this taking in and sorting out process, our perception also has its flaws, although hardly anyone ever notices them. Imagine you're walking down a street late at night. The shops are all closed, and as you pass a large window, you recognize it as the window of a restaurant because you see this pattern in the dim light which has been left on overnight. In a flash, you have interpreted the pattern, even though the information it contains is rather poor. You can't see any single shapes or objects, only this tangled pattern of dark and light. Now, this is really a problem, a visual problem, but you solved it in no time at all. You made sense of a meaningless pattern and read it very much as you read the figure 5, as a table, a chair in profile on the left, another chair, probably from the back, although you can't be sure, and another one lying on its back on top of the table. But if the table and chairs had been different in character and construction, if they had presented a different pattern from the one you saw, for instance like this one, you might have more or less ignored the difference and formed a picture in your mind very similar to the first example. You would still have read the pattern as table, chair in profile on left, chair from behind in center, chair on back on table. You soon forget whether each chair is heavy or slender, whether it has crossbars or not. Even if you were to see this picture sometime later, you might still think it was the same as the first pattern. You can recognize a table and 3 chairs in similar positions in each of these pictures. If you think that this couldn't happen to you, just try to remember the shapes of the letters in which the main title of your English book is printed. Which of these letters would come closest to that? The only thing the letters have in common is that they read the same, in the same way as the 3 patterns in the window read the same. But their shapes are entirely different. Look, for example, at the different letters G, which you all read in the same way. Whether we know it or not, most of us aren't really interested in shapes, colors and lines as such, but only in the things they add up to. As we move about, this act of recognition, converting shapes into things, goes on all the time. When we cannot recognize things in what we see, when we can't interpret them, we are uneasy. Somebody might say, "I can't see what it is," when he really means, "I can't interpret what I see or read what I see," for we always see something unless it's pitch dark. When we can't read the pattern of our environment, most of us believe we haven't seen anything. If you were a passenger in a car and saw a shape like this one looming up in the distance, you would naturally try to make sense of it. You'd try to fit all kinds of things you know into this shape, as you did with the table and chairs. You think of gasworks, a water tower, and many other possible things or interpretations. You might try to combine several such ideas to make up the shape, for instance, a bridge and a water tower, one in front of the other. But this time the shape refuses to be read. You can't recognize anything. So you go on trying. You examine it very hard, looking for possible clues, and in so doing you take in a great deal more of what there is in front of your eyes than you would have done if you had been able to recognize something straight away. For instance, if you had recognized the water tower in it, you might have forgotten it at once and stopped looking. We'll test this. What do you make of this shape? You could see it as an upright with a bar on top. From the base, something goes back into the distance, perhaps a shadow or a path which then turns sharply to the left and passes behind the upright. But you could also imagine all the shapes, or you could call them lines, lying in the same plane. A cross with a bar on top and 2 of its tips joined. A white triangle is formed inside the joined-up arms. And above, you can recognize 2 white squares, even though they are partly open. The shape doesn't appear to represent or mean anything, yet it has a suggestion of movement. The upright seems to plunge down the middle, is reflected upwards to the right, and then takes a sharp turn to the left. You may think of many other qualities of this strange shape. For instance, the white triangle may look rather small to you, and you might think that it could be made larger by making the black parts narrower, and that there is therefore a connection, a relationship between the black and the white parts. You may now ask yourself whether any of this would have occurred to you if you'd seen the shape upside down in the first place. Would you have seen the white triangle at all? Would you have thought about the movement of the black shape? This little test seems to show that we have two quite different ways of looking at our environment. The many shapes, colors, lines, masses and movements we see are lost as soon as we bundle them together as things. Or let's look at this shape. There is an upright shape which splits in two at the top. It's joined to a hook which points downwards but sends a spur upwards. The shape itself, as you can see, has a great deal to interest us, but the spaces are perhaps even more interesting. One of them curves down from the top, another curves upwards in the opposite direction, narrowly avoiding each other. The upper space has a square end, the lower one a round end, so that each one has its own character. Now let's give this shape a quarter turn. We immediately recognize the figures 2 and 3, although neither is complete, and at once we can't see any of the shapes and spaces we saw before. We have lost them. So it seems that there's a very important part of our environment, or you might say a certain aspect of our environment, which most people never see because it is hidden by the things we know and instantly recognize. If we didn't recognize the things in our environment quite so easily, this aspect of the environment might be easier to appreciate. Now, artists have been doing just this in many different ways for a long time. A picture such as this one has many things which we can still recognize: buildings, trees, a wall, and so on. But it also has other elements, shapes, colors, and lines, which belong to another kind of experience, the experience we received when we looked at the figure 4 upside down. In this painting, these two forms of experience exist together in a way which doesn't normally happen in real life. So we may say that art gives us an extra insight into our environment. In this picture, we can recognize a figure, but there is also a great deal that we can't be sure about. This is a woodcut, a method of making prints rather like the lino cuts or potato cuts, which you probably know already. It's a crude way of making pictures, and no great detail is possible. But the artist has turned this to good use. He has concentrated on the important shapes, making us more aware of them and of their play and their effect on each other. Some shapes are massed in, others are outlined with a heavy line or coarsely patterned. Some shapes are run together, for instance, the arm and the face. This print was hand-colored by the artist, which gave him the opportunity to soften some of the black shapes. The whole picture can be seen as a mass of shapes which have been arranged in a certain order. We can look at these shapes as shapes, and yet, if we wish, we may see the crouched figure of a girl in boots. If we look at only a small area, what the artist was trying to do becomes even clearer. He has not tried to show us what we normally call reality. We can't say this is a picture of a girl and leave it at that. The shapes and colors shout at us and claim our attention. Once again, we may experience the world of things and the world of shapes and colors at the same time, as we rarely do in real life. This painting also seems to stimulate us in two different ways. On the one hand, the scene looks almost familiar. On the other, it is strange and a little frightening. It reminds us of crowds of people, or indescribable objects, or animals, or perhaps all three, and yet we rarely see only shapes. We may think of something in science fiction, or something we seem to remember having seen a long, long time ago, perhaps under a microscope, and then the shapes come to the fore once more. In the space of a few seconds, we've drawn together several different experiences from the past. We may also have realized that they have something in common, and that there are surprising relationships between them. For instance, between very large and very small animals or things, or between natural shapes and artificial ones. We've been made to feel in a way in which we've perhaps never felt before, and our imagination has been roused. In this picture, recognizing things is just as difficult, perhaps impossible. We could read this painting in many different ways and imagine that it represents different situations. But we soon realized that this sort of thing isn't terribly important with a painting like this. The shapes and colors matter. We accept these shapes and colors in their own right, and the feelings which go with them. That is what the artist wanted us to do. If these two shapes, which are part of the same sculpture, were definite things, human heads for instance, we might try and identify them or compare them to people we know. But here we can't do any of these things, and so we look at them as shapes, in this case as solid shapes. We look at the small crisp planes, the flat surfaces, and compare them to each other. We notice the angles between them, which give each one a different degree of brilliance, and the spaces between the shapes. If you're looking only for things, you'll be disappointed in works like these. You'll feel that something vital, something important is missing. But that isn't so. In fact, something vital has been added to what we normally see. Our way of looking at and taking in our environment has been changed. It has been enlarged. Some people ask why it is that modern artists paint pictures and make sculptures which aren't real. That's to say, they don't show things as most people see them. By now, you may have one of the reasons needed to answer this kind of question. When you looked at the figure 4, the right way up, you lost sight of all the shapes as shapes, and the spaces as spaces, and the relationship between them. Yet these things, the shapes and the spaces and the relationship between them, are just as real as the fact that it's a figure 4. And some people would even argue that they are more important. Artists, by and large, make us aware of this greater reality which contains not only things, but also shapes, colors, lines, patterns and structures in their own right, which excite our feelings and rouse our imagination. Because of this, artists widen not only our awareness of the environment, but of the whole of life. Let's look at this problem in another way. As we grow up, we learn to recognize the things around us, as we recognize the figure 5 made up of little dots at the beginning. Once we form the idea of the figure 5, it doesn't matter if the shape is slightly different every time we see it. If, for instance, it appears in different printing typefaces. We deal with everything around us in the same way. Think back to when you were younger. Once you'd got the idea of a house in your head, if someone asked you to draw one, you probably always produced more or less the same form. And it was probably more or less the same form as other children of your age produced, in spite of you having seen lots of different kinds of houses. In the same way, the idea which most people have of a tree is a trunk with something vaguely round, fluffy and green on top. Every time you ask them to produce a drawing of a tree, it will be more or less the same, and a row of, say, 3 trees might turn out something like this. Of course, people realize that there are different kinds of trees and that these look different from each other, but even so, they form a picture in their minds, a mental image of the idea of a tree, and whenever they think tree, this is the image that comes up. If in this row of 3 trees, 1 tree were removed, that is, in the mind of the person thinking about the 3 trees, he would be left, as you might expect, with 2 trees. That would be the only difference as far as he's concerned. But is this the only difference? Now let's look at a row of real trees, not ideas of trees. No 2 groups of 3 trees are the same. In this one, as you can see, 2 of the trees are close together and there's a gap between them and the 3rd tree. The forms of the trees have something in common, but they are also different from each other, and this difference is difficult to express in words. As we look at them, we realize they are truly a group, in spite of their irregular spacing and varied shapes. The longer we look at them, the more we feel that they belong together, that there is a relationship, perhaps several relationships between them. They grew up together, and as they grew, they reacted to each other. For instance, 1 tree can spread its branches only where the next tree will let it, and the other way around. They have come to terms with each other. 1 tree may protect the other from the wind and the weather, and this too will be seen in the shape of each of them, and so on. Because there are many relationships of this kind between them, the trees seem to belong together. If one of these trees were removed, we shouldn't simply reduce their number from 3 to 2, we would also interfere with the relationships which hold them together. If you remove the tree on the left from the original group of 3, you are left with these 2 trees, which now give quite a different impression. If, on the other hand, you remove from the first group the single tree on the right, you are left with these 2 trees. Before, they were balanced by the single tree on the right. This balance is now missing. The 2 remaining trees are still in harmony with each other, but they look different. They give a different impression. It is difficult to talk about these relationships. We must look hard to discover them. In that first row of 3 trees, which all looked alike, it didn't matter much which tree you removed. The result would have been much the same. But here it does matter. Whichever tree you remove, the remaining 2 trees give a different impression. We've done more than just reduce the number from 3 to 2. We seem to have changed their meaning, rather as we may change the meaning of a sentence by leaving out a word. In fact, we could look at the 3 trees as a sentence, not a sentence of words, a verbal sentence, but a visual sentence. Between them, the trees express something, they say something, they have a meaning, rather like the sentences we use in speech. When we leave out one of our visual words, we change the meaning of the sentence. We could also change the meaning by arranging the trees in a different order, or putting a different kind of tree in place of one of them. So we can think of groups of shapes as visual sentences with meanings, but not all groups. If you write a number of words on a piece of paper, for instance, am, book, I, a, reading, they may be little more than a list of words, but arranged in a certain order, I am reading a book, in a sentence, they suddenly spring to life. They have a meaning. What was before only a list of words, in which no 2 words connected, is now something more than just a list. It's a sentence in which the words hang together. The words are still the same as before, but in this new arrangement they express something, they have a meaning. And often you can change their meaning by rearranging the words. It's like this with visual sentences. You may arrange a group of shapes to give them a meaning. But this meaning can't be explained or expressed in words, as we saw in the case of the trees. We can only see it and sense it, and we may change it by altering the position of the shapes. Let's look at the human hand from this point of view. Your hand. The fingers and thumb of the human hand are capable of forming visual sentences. Compare your hand relaxed with your hand in a state of tension. The different positions of the fingers and thumbs in relation to each other, and also the fact that they are bent in one case and not in the other, account for the different meaning they express. Even one finger slightly moved out of position or slightly straightened would change the meaning. We can make visual sentences with almost any kinds of shapes, so long as we realize that it's not only the individual shapes themselves, but the relationships between them which matter, as in the case of the trees and the hand. Take any number of simple shapes, such as these, and put them together in a way which relates them to each other, as here. They're now no longer 3 shapes, but a visual sentence, just as you make 3 words into a verbal sentence. Change their positions, and the visual meaning also changes. In each of these 4 arrangements, the 3 black shapes are the same. What is different is their relationship. Each group is a sentence with a meaning. The meaning is difficult to express in words, but we may say that roughly the first arrangement expresses solidity. The second, to the right of it, suggests displacement, that something is out of position. The third, bottom left-hand corner, expresses a sense of soaring. And the last, a state of balance. What we experience from these visual sentences is deeper and richer than the words I've used to describe them. When we rearrange the parts of a visual sentence, we not only change the meaning, but also affect each individual shape. A shape never looks the same in 2 different situations. Sometimes this change is slight, so that we hardly notice it. At other times, it's only too obvious. For instance, the shape in the center of each group is the same, yet how different it looks in each case, particularly in size. This difference is caused by the surrounding shapes and spaces. If we surrounded the center shape with shapes of a different color, we should affect it in yet another way. The time has come to sum up. First of all, we must learn to look beyond things. Remember again how the figure 4 lost its purely visual character as soon as we looked at it as a figure and not as a shape. We must learn to look at the visual character of all things. Secondly, we must understand that nothing can be considered by itself. Everything must be seen in relation to other things, that is to say, in visual sentences. In a visual sentence, the visual character of a thing matters more than what it is. In the past, people understood these simple truths when they built their environment. They added houses to each other so that they made sense. They didn't simply treat them as houses, but they also looked at and sensed their visual character. They didn't neglect the smallest details. In old towns, houses were either built at the same time or added to over years and generations, but this was always done in a way which created visual sentences. This would have been impossible without a clear sense of the visual character of things. Does this hold true of our own environment? Is the environment in which we live composed of visual sentences, or is it visual gibberish without any meaning? How much visual sense can we find in our environment? The answer is very little. But there's no need for this. It's not beyond us to make the modern environment as good as that of the past. Why shouldn't the houses we live in be related to each other as the trees we looked at were related to each other, so that they add up to a street and not just a row of houses, a sentence rather than a list of words? Of course, there have been examples in the last few years of how an environment which means something can be built. For instance, at Vanbrugh Park in London, houses are related to each other in a way which comes close to the way they were related in some of the towns of the Middle Ages. There is a variety of narrow, intimate spaces which lead to more open spaces on a larger scale, and they all hang together in one large, varied environment. Trees complete the scheme of houses and spaces. They are part of the environment and not an afterthought. We can see another example of a complete environment at the South Bank in London, where several buildings have been formed into one great visual sentence. Or perhaps we could describe something as complicated as this as a visual paragraph. In Paris, the gardens around the UNESCO building combine plants, sculpture and surfaces of many textures which add up to an overall form, an environment which is peaceful but never dull. And yet, in spite of these and many other achievements in building new environments, scenes like this are quite common in most towns, and you can see much worse. We may be appalled by an environment like this, but we shan't get very far in trying to change it unless we understand what exactly has gone wrong. And we shan't understand this unless we look beyond things, for reasons which will become even clearer as we go along, unless we look at the shapes, colors and relationships we see before they become things. We'll be trying to do this as we look at the next few film strips.